I'm excited about tonight. I received kind of what I call a cold call in the world of collections back probably late summer, I guess it was, last year, from Bob. And he talked to me about the wonderful IMSA Firehawk race car that he had been involved with, and decided that, kind of in honor of his partner and himself, that the car needed to go somewhere and have its history saved. And we, as the team here at Lane Motor Museum, agreed that it was a great fit for the collection here, and especially our racing collection. And so we gladly accepted Bob's offer to have this car here at the museum. And he was kind enough, after we met and the car got here, and he had all these wonderful stories he was telling us, he agreed to come here tonight and share the history of the car. So we are excited to hear about this car, hear the stories that many of us haven't heard yet, and hopefully, I think, get some laughs as well tonight. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Bob Yakushi.
Well, good evening, everyone, and I'm Bob Yakushi, and tonight I'd like to tell you a little bit about this 1987 Nissan 300ZX Firehawk race car that raced in the IMSA series. So I'll also talk a little bit about some of the races, select races in 87 and 88 that were kind of fun. All right, a little history about me. I worked for Nissan for 33 and a half years. And for the first 10 years, I got to race cars at the same time I was working at Nissan, which was pretty fun. I road raced motorcycles with my racing partner, Nelson Mark. And Nelson is really kind of the reason that this all came together. And I met him in college, and it was kind of a funny story how we met, because we're in the dorms. I'm walking past this dorm room, and there's all these trophies in the window. And so I just kind of walked in and introduced myself, and we had a passion for racing. He was a short track indoor racer, and I was a road racer on motorcycles. So that kind of became the friendship that we had, and that started back in about 1974. So we were road racing motorcycles, and I crashed at Riverside, and it ran me over. And about that time, Nelson suggested that we might race something that had a little more meat around it so it wouldn't kill me. So off we went into the world of sports cars. And as you can see, we were pretty successful in racing the sports cars. And in fact, in the SCCA series, we won 21 races in a row at that amateur level. And it ultimately led to the Firehawk series. So Hillcrest Engineering was formed in 1978, and we basically built Datsun race engines for teams as a way to support our racing habit. And we also later on built Firehawk Z turbo engines for select teams. Nelson, our engine builder, was also the engine builder for Electromotive, and I think some of you know about Electromotive, which was Nissan's race team that raced GTU, GTO, and then later on GTP. And he built the GTU and GTO Z-car engines. And of course, our race programs benefited from his knowledge and talent. The other amazing talent was a guy named Jack Havlin, and he was a very talented machinist who also worked at Electromotive. Jack later went on to run HRC, Honda Racing, in the U.S. as in the engine and machine shop area. Nelson and I worked full-time, and then Hillcrest Engineering was our after-work gig. And as my wife will tell you, we spent almost all our time there. In 1984, after we had gone to the Sports Car of America National Championship, TRD approached us, Toyota Racing Development, and asked if we would develop their Toyota Starlet program like we did the winning Datsun GT5 program. Well, the Starlet program was quite successful and started racing, winning races. Well, of course, as a Nissan engineer and the electromotive engine builder, Nissan really didn't like that too much. So they gave Hillcrest a car to start racing in the IMSA Firehawk and the SCCA Escort Endurance Series. So at the bottom here, you can see there's a 1984 version 1.0 and the 1986 version 2.0. Just to mention, that's Nelson, and the guy in the red there is a guy named Captain Kirk, like in the Star Trek series, but Kirk Kawaguchi, and he was a refueling guy at the races. So why were there 3 versions of the car? Well, I can tell you why. So at the Virginia International Raceway, at almost the end of the race, G.S. Johnson, one of the drivers, was chasing a lead car and lost it on the final corner onto the main straightaway. Instead of letting off the gas, he stayed in the gas, and it went off into the grass, across the racetrack, caught traction, and then proceeded into the pit wall. Well, as it hit the pit wall, it took aim at Nelson, who was standing on the pit wall. Everyone's yelling, "Move away," because a car is rolling down the pit wall and chasing him. So to add insult to injury, the car stops in front of the pit stand, and GS gets on the radio and says, "Is it bad?" Thus, the V version 3.0 of the 87 was born. So the 1987 Z originally started off as a pre-production vehicle, serial number 0015, and was made in Hiratsuka, Japan. These units were used to validate vehicle specifications in the US, and then also for press preview, for test drives. Most of these cars were crushed after their use, and I always hated to see Z cars and then later on GTRs crushed because they were considered sample cars and not street legal. But during this time, they were also allocated to race teams by the motorsports department. IMSA allowed basically minor changes to the vehicle, but rules are always open to interpretation. We were supported by my Nissan Engineering Japan relationship and connections there, and also others. As you can see right here, this backdoor support was European spec heads, turbos, factory calibrated ECU, high flow injectors, pistons, valve springs, bearings, pop-up valves, etc. And so it was really a neat effort because the guys in Japan, the Nissan engineers, many of them were former motorsports people and wanted to see a successful car. Also, for the suspension area, the included sway bars, let's see what else, sway bars, shocks, brakes, and adjustable conies, and some camber adjustments also. But the weak point were the brakes, and you really couldn't substitute out the brakes because, of course, IMSA would notice that. So we used custom-made Ferodo brake pads on there and did a lot of development on different types of compounds. All right, so the car started off as a red Z car, but was later into the current configuration, which is American Racing Wheels paint scheme. The cage in here, there, were by IMSA rules, had to be bolted in. So we had a custom cage built, and we had different bracing on it so that it would stiffen the vehicle. What kind of funny about this, and I'll talk a little bit about later, was Chevy, at the time were racing Camaros, they put the cages in, but they welded it in and then put fake bolts in it to circumvent it. But, you know, we'll talk about that in a minute. So this cooler right there wasn't the beer cooler for the drivers, but it was really an early cool suit system that was developed so to keep the drivers cool during the longer races, because most of these races were 3 to 24-hour races. So the other interesting thing was this drink bottle, and the drivers always said to put Gatorade in it, but we always just put ice water because the Gatorade, for whatever reason, went through the system more, and they had to use the restroom, but you know, you can't stop to use the restroom. Engine build. So the engine building was done by Nelson, and we had a separate shot, and you can see his sexy short pants when he was in there building engines. So the stock engine was about 205 horsepower at about 6.4 psi. But depending on the track, we had engine configurations for short and long tracks, and developed anywhere between 450 to 499 horsepower, and the boost varied from 10 to 17. So what's interesting about the boost is IMSA regulated the boost at around 10. Well, Nelson, being Nelson, developed a system where he could fool IMSA's boost gauges so that we could run 17 psi. Turbo lag was very minimal because we could change housings between our European housing, and also Air Research at the time was helping us with the A over R ratio for the turbos to get rid of the lag depending on the kind of track. Not very well known outside of just the Nelson and myself. The vehicle does hold the top speed record for a Firehawk car at 197 miles an hour. And this was done at Sebring. As some of you may know, Nissan limits the top speed to around 150. Well, there is a little wire that has purple with an orange, white tracer on it, and if you kind of modify that, it gets rid of the top speed. IMSA got wise to that, and that's why the factory ECU that my friend supplied still had the wire attached, but no top speed limit. What's interesting about the time that's at Sebring when it set that record was Gordon, the chief IMSA tech guy, asked why RZ was the only car that was letting out blue flames out the tailpipe when you let off. And what was our answer to that? It's the IMSA gas you guys supply. Drivers, we had P.J. Jones, who's the son of Parnelli Jones, G.S. Johnson, who I met when we were racing the GT sports cars, and he became a very good friend of ours and ended up driving. But he actually was the general service manager at, I believe it was Downey Nissan at the time. And of course, yours truly was a test driver, relegated to a test driver. And so what I would do is, you know how the primary drivers jet set in, go and eat. Well, I used to do the test setups at the different tracks, so I still got to race the car. You can see Pernelli there. This is GS, and that's PJ. Of course, we did have our beauty shots at Road America. For the pit crew, race strategy was Nelson, Mark, and myself, and the crew chiefs that handled the car were Nelson and Jack Havlin. And then refuelers, we had Ed Brothers, Kirk Kawaguchi, and then on tire changes and brakes were Jimmy Ige, Carl Carlson, Just Chen, and Derek Ige. So all of these guys are super race enthusiasts. Already talked about Nelson and Jack, but Ed was a top field driver at one time and joined that elite 5-second club. Kirk Kawaguchi was a race enthusiast and came aboard with us. And then Jimmy Ige is a very well-known NHRA junior fuel driver. Carl Carlson was part of TRW and helped with some of the design. Jess Chen worked for Electromotive and was actually a crew guy on the car. And then Derek Ige, who is Jimmy's son, was also an IndyCar pit crew guy for, I think it was Al Unser Jr., and one of the youngest guys to actually get an Indy 500 ring when Al Unser Jr. won. So we had a quite talented and dedicated crew, all of which, other than Jack, were not paid. They were all just in for it for the fun. Jack, of course, was our machinist, so you need to kind of make sure he can buy groceries. So let's talk a little bit about some of the races in '87 and '88. So in Columbus, G.S. Johnson was named the rising star in the Firehawk series, which was really a big deal because there were so many well-known drivers that were in that series. So you can see the neat trophy cup, and then all of us hamming it up. This is PJ driving, and what was funny about this race is it comes in, he goes, gosh, it will not go into gear. And we asked PJ, what's going on? And he goes, well, going around the corners, I'm kind of holding on to the steering wheel and the gear shift lever. And go, why are you holding on the gear shift lever? Well, it's kind of the G-force stuff. Well, he was holding on to the gear shift lever and wearing the synchros down. So after qualifying, and you think he got it up on like third in the grid, we had to rebuild the transmission before the race, and we told him, don't do that again. Well, we did end up in the top 5 finish. So here we go to Sebring. This is a good one. So here's an interesting story, and I think if you can see this right here, this is the refueling rig, and this was one that Jack and Nelson designed for max flow compared to the refueling rigs at the time that other teams were using, which were a 55-gallon drum basically tilted. So IMSA had at the bottom of that refueling rig a max height of 6 feet. So by taking this big, large, square tank, we were able to get the maximum head pressure so we could get the flow rate really high. Well, the other thing that they said was you had to use a gas pump nozzle, and you couldn't use, like a quick fuel can. So most of the teams used a gas pump nozzle, and we were reading the rules, and it said pump nozzle, not gas pump, but everyone's using gas pump. We use a diesel fuel nozzle because it's bigger, and then we had it ported and flowed by the head flow guy next door to our shop. So the other funny thing was, as you know, if you cool fuel, you can get more in the gas tank. So Jack came up with an idea of having an extra width around that, and he put dry ice in it to cool the fuel. Well, that worked really well until IMSA came along and sees the dry ice outgassing, and it looks like something happening. So we got away with it for a couple of races, and then they outlawed it. So this is also the race that it set the top speed record of 197 miles an hour. And as a result of that, they impounded the car after the race, made us take out the engine and tear it apart, and then they also looked at the ECU. Well, funny thing is, it passed all of that, but we, who finished, I think it was in 4th, after a 12-hour race, got DQ'd because there was of the differential. What's funny about this is Nissan supplied a limited slip plated differential, but after a while it would heat up. So instead, we changed it to a Torsen-Gleason type differential, which if you know what a Torsen-Gleason is, it's a planetary gear type rear differential that expands out and does basically the same thing as a LSD. Well, when we got disqualified, they also took the Chevy Camaros in, and they told everyone, take your roll cages out. Well, guess what? They had them welded in. They couldn't take it out, so first place gets DQ'd also. I think second place also. And they checked their ECUs, and they weren't factory ECUs. You could tell where they had unsoldered chips and put new ones in. So IMSA got a lot smarter after that race. Sears Point, interesting race. As you know, Sears Point up in Sonoma, California is a very up and down, twisty type track. So BMW was running their cars, and I think it was Ray Corman that was the BMW driver. Joe Vardy was in the Chevy Camaros, but it turned out to be a real big race between RZ car and the BMW there. And it was an amazing race where the pit stops were the key, and we used a lot of the NASCAR ideas to shorten the pit stops on the wheel nuts and on the brakes. But we earned a well-earned second place at that race, and it was one of the few races that were close to home because I'm from the Bay Area, and so we had the family come out and they were all cheering and everything. But it was a great race. The next race was in '88. That was a pretty memorable one. And as we pull up to go to the race and pulling the race car trailer, there's just a sign that says Fairgrounds. And so West Palm Beach, they decided to run the race at a fairground, and they put Armco barriers, as you can see here, up, but it was basically on a fairground property. So no overhead pit covers or anything, and of course at the time we forgot to bring the tent. So we're out in the baking sun. You also had to share pits with other crews because it was so small. So at that one, it was tires and brakes that wore really quickly, and PJ was exceptionally hard on them. However, we finished in the top 10, but IMSA didn't like that we borrowed the GTP engine for our car. And so they said, hey, that's taking a little too far. The next fun race was Road America, and that really played into how the Z car really shined on because it was fantastic for straightaway speeds. And the long straights were very hard on the brakes, but we did end up taking a top 3 placing with both PJ and GS driving. And as you can see here, we're trying to figure out where that weird tick, tick, tick noise is. And that was during qualifying. We never did find it, and they actually just let the car go. And Nelson was voting for change the engine. Everyone else is voting don't change the engine. But you can see down here, once again, they impounded the car, mainly because they still didn't believe that it was totally stock and the trap speeds were getting down the straightaway. But it was stock. All right, we're down to the last race that I want to talk about. And this is in 1988 in the Watkins Glen 24-hour race. And there's a couple of funny stories on this one, and my wife will appreciate this. And I think Alice, who's watching on Zoom, will appreciate this. This was our 10th anniversary. And What happened was Alice had baked cupcakes that said happy anniversary on it. Nelson's driving and we're going to the pits. And so Nelson always kind of drives like a madman, and he's driving to the pits. We're on a dirt road, and the wives are in the back. Alice is holding these cupcakes. It made it all the way from California to Watkins Glen unscathed. And of course, the last little dip, Nelson kind of gassed it. So when you open the cupcakes, all the frosting's on the top of the lid. So the other thing is, for many years, and I have to say, my wife was so good at all of our holidays, our anniversaries, and some birthdays were spent at the racetrack. So she was a real trooper all those years, and I really appreciate and love her for that. So back to the track. So as you can see here, IMSA really started to get curious about why all these, quote, stock cars were going so darn fast. And it wasn't just us. It was the Chevys and the other Zs. They were also even bringing out cars, stock cars, to look at ride height. And why were our cars like 2 inches lower than these other cars? And we just told them, hey, after racing, it's spring sag. They did look at the color codes on the coils, but hey, they were the right color codes. Imagine that. So at this particular track, at the driver's meeting, we're all standing in the driver's meeting, and they were talking about speed differential between the GT category cars and some of the other slower cars, and particularly at night. And they specifically pointed out to PJ, who they said PJ loves to tap, a love tap to the slower cars in corners, which he tended to do when they were in his way. And so he did this at night a lot because the corner workers couldn't see him doing that. And so the only way that he would get caught was the paint scratches always gave him away. So here we have a great F1 style pit stop, and that includes a brake change. And so it's a driver change, a tire change, a brake change, and a refuel. And brakes were basically the longest part of this stop, but the front brakes could be done in about a minute. The rear brakes, you really didn't have to do much because rear brakes don't really stop the car. So if you also look, let's see, I think it's in this picture, right here, the other team started to try and copy our refueling rig because our refueling was much faster. So we could do the driver change and the brake change, and our car would be fuel, and the other cars were still sitting there refueling the fuel. But this is basically a sequence here of when the car came in, when we started to do a driver change, tire changes, brake change, still doing brake change, Kirk putting in the water, and then still doing a little bit of work on the brakes, and then finally PJ telling GS to get the hell out of the pits. So 24 hours really takes a toll on the crew. And you can see Jimmy and Jess sleeping, Ed sleeping, Jimmy looking after tires. I think this later on was Ed refueling the refueling rig, and then PJ pondering kind of what's going on. But at that 24-hour race, we did end up placing in the top 3. At the end of the year, I think we ended up about 4th overall in the series, even with that DQ. So here's our another top 3 finish at the end of the 24 hours. But notice that right there? That's the P.J. Jones PP car push out of the way. So they always knew if P.J. hit another one of the slower cars. But this car, after 1988, we basically stopped racing the Firehawk series, and then we went to SCCA and did a couple of endurance races, and actually raced it in what they called SSGT back then. But the car was a little over that, so we actually raced it in GT1. And we actually changed some of the control arms and other things, and actually won the 3-hour endurance race at Willow Springs in GT1. We also had the opportunity for Kurt Kawaguchi's brother to get his SCCA license in this car. And he was, I think, a pretty big Porsche fan, but Bruce was just in awe of how fast that car was. And I think Rob got his license also with us. Yeah, I think in that car also. And Rob Fair, who's over in the audience, went on to race Formula Ford. So that's about all I have here about this car that I can think of. And what I wanted to do was just, last slide just says thank you. And just want to appreciate everyone for coming out tonight. And I know a lot of my friends and former crew are on the Zoom call. And I know Nelson is the reason the car is really here, because unfortunately he passed away last year. And so I know that he always wanted this car to remain, around so that it had some history. But really the whole dedication of the car is really in the memory of Nelson. So I know his wife is watching, and I wanted to say, here it is, Alice. It's in the museum, just like we all talked about. Thank you very much. Derek?
Thank you. Number one, thank you, Bob. So many more stories than what I'd already heard from you. And we're going to do a quick Q&A. I want to kick it off because Bob skipped a story that he told me, and hopefully he'll tell it. Hopefully this is. But you told me a story about when you would do victory laps. When you would do a victory lap, and your special, the person who would ride with you on those laps.
Oh, yeah. So when we used to win races, they used to give you the checker flag and you do a victory lap. Well, before the Firehawk car, we used to take my mom, who attended every race, and she attended a lot of the Firehawk races, and we put her in the car, and I do remember her holding the flag and then screaming most of the way around. And I know she's watching. She says, oh, no, I didn't scream, but yeah. Over the sound of the race engine, you could see her going, ah! But, yeah.
All right, so do we have questions? I mean, come on, we got like half a Nissan here, so you guys got to have questions about racing history, right? Evidently, Bob just did too good of a job. All right, we'll start right up here.
With the stock seats, even with the harnesses, how did you actually stay in the driver's seat of the car?
Yeah, so actually that is not we used to have a race seat in there, but it got taken out and put into another car. But it had, full harnesses, a 5-point harness.
Hi, Bob. Good to see you again. Sean McNamara.
Oh, yeah.
I'm glad you confirmed one thing tonight. Back in 87, 88, I was at Pontiac. Do you remember Doug and Tom Goad? They ran Trans Ams in the same series. I remember Tom would come to meetings because he was a chief engineer for Pontiac, and he'd come in after the race. He goes, there's no way they're running stock boost. I know that thing is tweaked. So now, thank you for finally confirming that after, 30 plus years.
Well, what's funny about that is we used to always say, those Camaros cannot be stock, neither can the Pontiacs. Yeah. Well, you know what it's called? It's called rule interpretation.
Any other questions? I have the mic right here.
Ah, yes, Colin.
Hey, Bob. I have a question about the rear suspension. So I raced in '84 with that semi-trailing arm rear suspension. I had a terrible time trying to get camber to work. Were you able to adjust the pickup points on it legally?
So they didn't, yeah. Well, that's interesting because, they didn't allow you to use Heim joints or anything on it. So a company, I think they're on there, Suspension Techniques, made us bushings that we could press in and we could rotate the bushings. They were offset so you could get the camber. And this Z car did not have, basically in production, it did not have that trailing throttle oversteer that the 280Z and the, basically 280ZX had. So the engineering that went into it, originally, it got rid of the trailing throttle oversteer on it, which for those of you who don't know is that when you let off on the throttle going into the corner, basically it goes from basically a slightly negative to 0 or a positive camber, and the car will swing around. And this car from the beginning did not have that. But we were able to get negative camber in there. And on the front, I think, Derek, if you ever take it apart, you'll see that there's actually a front camber adjustment, but when you look at it, it looks stock. Right? For the Camaros? Well, don't know anything about that, yeah.
Did you share any information with BRE or Bob Sharp, since they were running, Nissans also, BRE.
Oh, BRE?
BRE and Bob Sharp. Yeah. You share any information with them?
No, at the time, I'm trying to think if, I don't remember that Bob Sharp actually ran a car, because back then it was Newman and Cruz, and they actually did, I think at Atlanta, I know Tom Cruise, when he was doing the, Days of Thunder movie, was before we actually started racing, but we did, at Road Atlanta, there were Z cars there, and actually was fortunate enough to give them a tour in the car, and then Annette actually got a signed autograph from Paul Newman. Mainly because Paul didn't believe I was married, and because she never came to any of the races, but. But BRE, Brock Racing Enterprises, had by that time had, already, I guess, was not around. And then actually, John Knepp started Electromotive and was doing some of the BRE, I think, clutches and flywheels and things like that. But eventually all kind of went to Electromotive, and that's when Don Devendorf and John Knepp started that whole business.
I worked for Garrett Aviation in Los Angeles for quite a number of decades. They changed names a little further down, but they were involved with the turbo, your turbocharger. You had mentioned about some housing changes to try to mitigate the turbo lag. What can you tell me about Air Research? Any insight into that, or did you just get the final product and you didn't really know or familiar with the development of the turbos?
Yeah, on the turbochargers, there was an Air Research employee, and I remember his first name was Todd, but he actually supplied us with, between the European turbos that we got from Nissan, he ended up matching the compressor wheel and the turbine wheel, and then did different types of housings on the exhaust side and on the compressor side to reduce the lag that we had. But he took care of all that, and we ended up basically with a lot of the final, the final product. But it was a lot of mix and match, and I do recall him saying something about that he had taken the Lancia Stratos Delta turbo that they had some parts for, and incorporating that into the our turbochargers. But I can tell you that the systems that Nelson came up with and that Todd used on the turbochargers, when you stood on that thing in second gear, it'd push you back in the seat and light up the tires. So it was definitely no lag in there. It was almost like driving a naturally aspirated car, you know, with a ton of horsepower.
First wanted to thank you guys, because I was a IMSA pit marshal there at the Glen, SCCA races, and I actually saw this car, so it's great to see it again. I remember seeing Newman come by too. You'd spot his blue eyes before he got anywhere near the pits. And if it's any consolation, I will add that the IMSA Trans Am had a super weak rear axle. It was tiny and locked it up. I was there the night it locked up coming onto the front straight there. And of course, Gouldstrand running his water injection, you know, that's another little thing. But I wanted to find out what shape the car is in today. Does it run? And what are Lane's plans for it?
So, sorry, Bob, the question was what condition the car is in today and what Lane's plan, the Lane Museum's plan is with it. So I can answer that. You know, the car, as you see it sitting, is pretty much in the condition it last raced, other than some of the things that Bob mentioned with the seats being changed, you know, back to stock seats and a few things. Currently, the car is not in running condition. I believe Bob said it ran, was it maybe 10, 15 years ago was the last
10,
time?
15 years ago,
Yeah. However, as many of you that are members and maybe even some of the Nissan folks that are here that know the Lane Motor Museum, you know, we do pride on ourselves on the majority of the collection running and driving. And so it is slated that this car will run and drive again. We don't know exactly when that will be. We've got some major restorations going on in the restoration shop, but we can tell you that this car will be heard again. And Bob has been kind enough to offer that when we do get to that point, that he will at least lend some advice on, you know, exactly what is inside of this engine, because it is not a, well, it is a stock engine according to IMSA and the pit marshal that was listening tonight. So that was that question. Do we have another Zoom question, or should we go up? There was a gentleman up here that had another question. You, sir? Yeah.
Hey, Bob, just curious, from the time that you stopped campaigning the vehicle till now, where has the car been?
So when we stopped racing, basically we closed the shop. And the race shop was kind of interesting because we actually owned everything. We didn't have any outstanding debt. So when we closed the shop, Nelson moved to Long Beach, and everything went into his extended garage, the whole machine shop, and the car went there. So he had a Mustang project that kind of took priority, so the Z car kind of sat outside underneath our car cover for years. And I mean, I was really surprised it was still in as great condition as it is. But it's kind of where it was. And then when he passed away, his wife, you know, kind of said, what are we going to do with this? And so that's when I called Derek and see if Lane Car Museum would be interested in having it. So I'm glad it's here. It's not, you know, most of the sample cars, when you get a sample car, you have to sign a contract, and basically they're what we call dollar cars. So the transaction actually is $1, and then you sign basically ownership that says off-road only, and when you're done with it, you crush it. Well, you know, the one car you definitely crushed, and version 1 also got crushed, but this one, you know, just did not have the heart to, you know, see it go to scrap. So, you know, it's kind of a piece of history, and P.J. Jones and Parnelli drove it, so you know, it's got some history to it. And I drove it, which is, of course, the best.
All right. Any further Zoom questions coming in?
Oh, there's one more
Oh,
there.
we got another one. Where at? Oh, all right. I'll sneak up behind you here. Don't let me surprise you.
Thank you. I'm just curious about the fuel injection system and how you guys set it up to run with 500 horsepower, and how did you tune it?
So that's interesting because we did not have the sophisticated equipment that's today, where you can put it on a laptop and adjust fuel flow and everything. So what we ended up doing was best guesses. And so high flow injectors that we obtained from Nissan, and then the engineers knew general parameters of what we were doing and what the boost numbers were doing. So they were able to pre-program an ECU based off of the stock profile and just kind of adjust everything up. And that's partially the reason that you get all the excess fuel out the back and, it lights up. So none of the other Z cars, kind of had that. And Gordon used to complain all the time, why is it doing that? Hey, IMSA gas, what can we say?
Thank you, Bob. Racing has a great way of exposing vehicle weakness. What is the weakness with this vehicle, and what did you do to overcome it?
Brakes were the biggest thing. Certainly not horsepower and certainly not handling, but the brakes were the biggest thing. And so we did use different types of brake pad compounds. And we ended up using, I think it was GTO pads that were being used by Electromotive, and actually machining those pads. And then we take the car to Willow Springs, for example, and spend the whole day breaking in the pads, burning in the green pads so they could be used. I do remember one of the other teams that we built engines for was there, and they saw what we were doing, so they were kind of copying a little bit. And so we were at Sears Point, and my wife will remember this, that they said, hey, Bob, why don't you jump in our car and, test it and tell us what's going on. So they didn't tell me that they had green pads in the back. So coming down the S's at Sears Point, tapped the brakes and the thing spun around and I rolled it. And there's a set of grandstands on that back straightaway at Sears Point, and my mom was there. And she goes, oh my God, what happened? Well, I ended up with a pretty severe concussion from a roll bar piece that one of their crew members had stopped by our shop when we were building this car, and we had just thrown a piece of roll bar pipe into the car, someplace to put it, and they thought it was extra bracing. So naturally they put it in thinking they'd have the same system that we had, but it turned out giving me a pretty bad concussion. But I will say that this car was and the other Z cars were very helpful in the development of the 1990Z, which was called the 901 project, which I think, Colin, you'll remember. So it was called the 901 project, which was 1990 #1 sports car. And that 300ZX, a lot of the brakes, things that happened on this car for brakes and some of the other things, engines and turbochargers, were actually some of the things that were incorporated as design ideas for that 901 project. And the Nissan did in 1990 get the Sports Car of the Year award, #1 sports car. And a lot of the competitors ended up using that the 300ZX at 1990 to, what was it, 1994 or 5, roughly as the benchmark for what a sports car should be. So, the Firehawk racing really paid off in the development area.
Hey, Bob. Is it possible for someone like me today to get a pre-production car for $1 if I promise to eventually crush it?
Well, you know, if you want to go racing, there are, you know, SCCA is a great way to get in. I mean, that's how I started. I started in C Sedan back in 1978, and then worked my way up. But you can get in what they call showroom stock category, and basically what you need is roll cage and, you know, basic safety equipment, tires, and very limited on what you can do with shocks and springs and sway bars. But it's a, I'll say, relatively inexpensive way to get in. But, you know, this car back in 88 with American Racing Wheels, and the budget was probably about $100,000 to run a whole year. But that included everything we needed for the car, airfare, you know, crew hotels, all that type of stuff. But, you know, we had a relatively small budget compared to some of the other teams.
Thanks.
All right. Well, I want to first thank Bob for agreeing to talk tonight and telling us all these amazing stories, and also for letting the car come here and be part of the collection in honor of your partner and you and everything Nissan did with this car. It's an incredible addition to the Lane Motor Museum collection, and we're very, very proud to have this car here. Matter of fact, tomorrow it is just going to move down into the Competition Classics exhibit. So it will be on exhibit starting tomorrow here at the museum for the foreseeable future. So telling the story of Hillcrest Engineering. So, and thank you all for coming out tonight and hearing about the new addition to the collection. We thank you guys for your support and obviously your support of Bob and everything he did for Nissan and Hillcrest Engineering. So, and to everyone on Zoom, thanks for joining us. And hopefully with some of the folks from Hillcrest that are on the Zoom, we'll be talking to you soon as well. Bob and I have some thoughts about some things we can do with the folks out in California. So thank you all for coming out tonight, and we hope you enjoyed yourselves.
Thank you.